In the previous chapter, we explained how Synanon dissolves its members' marriages, separated children from their parents, and established absolute control over their bodies. If you wish, you can watch that chapter through the link above. That dark scene where Dederich assumed the role of a god. But while all of this was happening, where was the outside world? This never-ending operation within Synanon world one day crossed the walls and turned the organization into a crime machine. And that is exactly where we are now. Welcome to the Illuminated Investigations. In this episode, we will discuss Synanon's armed groups, acts of violence, its multi-million dollar shadow economy, and most importantly, the poisonous Rattlesnake attack that brought the organization down. But first, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications, because this file is getting deeper and the darkness is growing. Now, let's begin. Synanon's armed structure did not emerge during the organization's early years. It began to appear from the mid-1970s onward, as the movement became increasingly authoritarian and paranoid, especially after 1975. Under the leadership of Charles Dederich, Synanon began to believe that anyone who criticized it was a threat. Originally founded as a community aimed at rehabilitating drug addicts, Synanon gradually transformed into a structure isolated from the outside world, living by its own rules and controlling every aspect of its members' lives. During this transformation, journalists, former members, families, lawyers, and government institutions began to examine Synanon's activities more closely. Charles Dederich did not see these criticisms as simple public pressure. In his view, Synanon was surrounded by enemies. Former members were defined as traitors, journalists as attackers, and government institutions as forces attempting to destroy the organization. This mindset spread the belief within the organization that they were under constant siege. In this atmosphere, Synanon gradually began to militarize its security units. Teams carrying weapons were formed among the members. Some sources describe this structure as the Imperial Marines or Synanon Special Security Force. This group was not an official military unit. However, in practice, it acted as the organization's protection, intimidation, and when necessary, attack force. By 1977 to 1978, these teams were no longer merely providing facility security. They had taken on duties such as monitoring individuals who opposed Synanon, observing dissidents, and intimidating them when necessary. Organization members received firearms training, stood guard, and semi-military discipline was implemented in some facilities. Charles Dederich's speeches also played an important role in this transformation. Dederich frequently stated that Synanon was at war and prepared members for an approaching struggle. This theoretic caused many members to view violence as a legitimate method of defense. As a result, Synanon's armed group was not a structure established by a single decision on a specific date. Rather, it was a security and repression mechanism that gradually emerged during the mid-1970s under the influence of growing criticism and Dederich's paranoia. However, with the Rattlesnake attack against Paul Morantz in 1978, this structure attracted national attention for the first time and became one of the events that accelerated Synanon's collapse. However, the emergence of these armed teams alone does not fully explain the situation. The real question was this: how did Synanon find people who would show such absolute loyalty? And how did it make them carry out the organization's orders without questioning them? By the mid-1970s, Charles Dederich authority had become almost unquestionable. Members were convinced that absolute loyalty to the leadership was necessary for the continuation of both the organization and their own lives. Those selected for armed security teams or special assignments were generally chosen from among the most loyal members. These were individuals who had spent years within the organization, adopted Dederich's views, and developed the trust toward the outside world. Although there is no extensive evidence that these individuals received formal military training, it is known that they were trained in firearm use, security duties, guard systems, and the surveillance of target individuals. Some former members described armed patrols and regular security practices becoming increasingly common at the organization facilities. The important point is this: Synanon's capacity for violence did not stem from directly selecting people to be aggressors, but from years of psychological attachment and group pressure that caused some members to stop questioning the leadership's order. For this reason, many researchers argue that Synanon's most powerful weapon was not firearms, but the psychological control system it established over its members. The network of loyalty created through this system was eventually used not only to maintain discipline within the organization. Journalists, former members, and legal professionals who criticized Synanon also began to become targets. The organization was resorting to increasingly aggressive methods against those who opposed it. However, we must make an important distinction. Not all Synanon members participated in acts of violence, and the organization's early years were primarily known as a rehabilitation community. Yet, from the mid to late 1970s, the core leadership under Charles Dederich adopted an increasingly harsh security and repression strategy. Among documented incidents, the most strongly evidenced one is the 1978 Rattlesnake attack. Many other actions appear in testimonies, court records, and press reports as allegations of threats, surveillance, intimidation, and physical assault. The armed security teams within the organization patrolled facilities, stood guard, and strictly monitored people entering from outside. Former members, journalists, and critics reported methods such as being followed, harassed by telephone, having people sent to their doors, and creating a constant sense of surveillance. There are testimonies indicating that information was collected about the addresses, daily routines, and connections of individuals who filed lawsuits against Synanon or publicly criticized it. Not at all of these activities are documented to the same degree in every case. However, the overall picture indicates that the organization established an organized security network aimed at intimidating its opponents. Investigative journalists and some individuals who left Synanon reported that smear campaigns were conducted against them, that they received threatening messages, and that they were forced to live with the fear of physical attack. Press coverage from the period contains numerous reports indicating that Synanon labeled its critics as enemies and responded aggressively. Although some of these incidents were not directly determined by court rulings to be attacks planned by the organization, allegations of threats and intimidation were extensively documented. The best documented incident, the Rattlesnake attack against Paul Morantz, 1978. This event occupies a special place because it demonstrated Synanon's capacity for violence in a concentrated way. Target: attorney Paul Morantz, who worked on lawsuits against Synanon. Method: being bitten by a venomous rattlesnake placed in Morantz's mailbox. Result: Morantz was seriously injured but survived. Judicial process. Investigations and court proceedings concluded that the attack had been planned by individuals connected to Synanon, seriously damaging the organization's public legitimacy. This case and the investigations that followed are considered among the turning points that accelerated Synanon's collapse. We will discuss the planning and execution details of this attack shortly. But first, we must also address the financial power of an organization that could become this reckless. Because no organization that does not possess a certain level of financial power can be this fearless and audacious. We explained this part in detail in previous videos. If you wish and have not watched them, you may also take a look at those videos. Now, however, we will discuss how the collected money was used. A significant portion of the collected funds initially did indeed go towards rehabilitation activities, operation of housing facilities, food services, healthcare expenses, educational programs, opening new facilities. However, as the organization grew, the scope of expenditures expanded as well. By the 1970s, Synanon owned large properties in different regions of California, had purchased hundreds of acres of land, operated numerous buildings and facilities, financed its own security structure. This situation led to increasing questionings regarding the extent to which the organization's financial resources were being used for rehabilitation purposes. By the late 1970s, Synanon's total assets were estimated to have reached tens of millions of dollars. In today's money, this corresponds to an economic value of hundreds of millions of dollars. The organization was no longer a small rehabilitation center, but a major institution with substantial real estate holdings and an extensive economic network. At the heart of the issue was a lack of transparency. From the outside, donations were believed to be collected for the rehabilitation of addicts. However, internally, the organization was becoming increasingly authoritarian, establishing total control over members' lives and directing a significant portion of resources toward priorities determined by the leadership. And critics eventually began asking the following question: are people really donating to save addicts, or are they unknowingly financing an organization that is increasingly becoming a cult? This question would later become central to tax investigations and financial examinations. Synanon's financial power was not only about the amount of donations it received. The organization's growing wealth and complex financial structure had begun attracting the attention of federal authorities. Before long, not only how Synanon collected donations but also how those funds were stored and reported would come under scrutiny. Yes, we are talking about allegations of tax evasion and money laundering. For many years, Synanon benefited from tax advantages as a charitable organization and rehabilitation institution, and this was its legitimate right. But over time, federal agencies began asking the following questions: was the organization truly operating like a charity, or had it become a closed-cost structure controlling its members? Were the collected donations being used for public benefit? Was the leadership obtaining personal gain? The increasing number of these questions was largely due to the organization's growing authoritarianism and its departure from rehabilitation activities. The IRS, Internal Revenue Service, the United States Tax Authority, began examining Synanon's tax-exempt status. Officials were particularly interested in how donations were being used, records of assets obtained from members, the organization's commercial activities, financial advantages provided to the leadership, expenditures inconsistent with tax-exempt status. As the investigations progressed, criticism grew that Synanon had become less a rehabilitation center and more a close organization controlled by Charles Dederich. In the late 1970s, the IRS took steps toward revoking Synanon's tax-exempt status. According to officials, the organization no longer appeared to be a charitable institution operating primarily for the public good. This decision was a major blow to Synanon because a significant portion of the organization's economic model depended on tax advantages, donations, its charitable image. The loss of tax-exempt status seriously weakened the financial structure of an organization already struggling with increasing legal problems. The money laundering rumors, however, are somewhat exaggerated claims. Historical records do not provide strong evidence that the organization conducted a systematic, mafia-style money laundering operation. The authorities' primary focus was tax irregularities, the accuracy of financial records, misuse of charitable status, the manner in which organizational funds were used. For this reason, it is more accurate to speak of investigations into tax irregularities and financial mismanagement. To say that it was a money laundering organization would go beyond the currently available historical evidence. This financial structure also raised questions about living standards. During Synanon's early years, the organization presented itself as an egalitarian community. Members worked together, lived together, and believed they were making sacrifices for a common purpose. However, as the years passed and as the amount of money under control increased, the difference in living standards between the upper management and ordinary members became increasingly visible. Most members who joined Synanon lived within the community system. Their daily lives were largely determined by the organization. Where they would live, what job they would work in, whom they would spend time with, even during certain periods, whom they would marry, could all be directed by the leadership. Many members worked long hours in Synanon's businesses or facilities. In return, rather than receiving direct salaries, housing, food, basic necessities were provided by the organization. The number of members able to maintain their own economic independence gradually declined. Many individuals had transferred all their assets or income into the Synanon system. Although Charles Dederich was theoretically a member of the community, in practice, he was its undisputed leader. As the organization grew, a privileged circle of administrators began to form around him. According to former members, Dederich's decisions could not be questioned. Senior administrators enjoyed greater privileges. They had greater access to resources. Their influence within the organization was incomparable to that of ordinary members. This situation increasingly contradicted Synanon's claims of equality. At this point, we need to draw attention to something. Extreme examples seen in some cults, such as private jets, palaces, or personal fortunes for hundreds of millions of dollars, have not been clearly documented in Synanon. However, the following situation is clearly visible. The people who had the greatest control over the organization's large properties, facilities, and financial resources were the leadership cabinet. Ordinary members, on the other hand, were tied to the communal living system, could not accumulate personal wealth, and were largely deprived of economic independence. Therefore, the issue was not merely living in luxury, but also the enormous inequality in access to power and resources. For this reason, Synanon's growing power and increasing methods of repression had begun attracting attention from the outside world. One person in particular was trying to stop the organization's activities through legal means. Because of the lawsuits he filed and the investigations he conducted, he soon became one of Synanon's greatest enemies. One of the names most frequently mentioned in the story of Synanon's collapse is California attorney Paul Morantz. If Charles Dederich represents the rise of the organization, Paul Morantz is regarded as one of the most important figures in forcing Synanon to begin answering legally for its actions. Morantz was not initially an activist or journalist targeting Synanon. He was an attorney known primarily for consumer rights and fraud cases. However, during the mid-1970s, former members who had left Synanon and their families began approaching him with various complaints about the organization. These complaints were far more serious than ordinary disputes. Among the allegations were the breakup of families, psychological pressure on members, the separation of children from their parents, forced divorces, threats and intimidation activities. When Morantz began investigating these claims, he realized that there were major differences between the rehabilitation center image that Synanon presented to the public and what was being described by insiders. Morantz was not merely criticizing the organization. He was actively involved in lawsuits filed against Synanon. These lawsuits defended the rights of former members, brought the organization's practices before the courts, contributed to the examination of Synanon's financial and administrative structure. This increasingly came to be viewed as a serious threat by Charles Dederich and the leadership cadre, because Morantz's work was not only causing reputational damage, it was also exposing the organization to legal risks worth millions of dollars. By the late 1970s, Synanon's leadership had begun viewing its critics not as ordinary opponents, but as enemies trying to destroy the organization. Within this mindset, Paul Morantz occupied a special position because he possessed legal expertise. He could influence court proceedings. He worked with former members. He was gathering information about Synanon's internal structure. According to many former members and researchers, Morantz had become one of the greatest threats to the organization's existence in the eyes of the leadership. As the number of cases involving Morantz increased, Synanon's attitude toward him also began to harden. He would later describe being followed, being threatened, and being subjected to pressure. However, events would soon reach a much more dangerous point. An incident that occurred at Morantz's home on October 10, 1978 would attract the attention not only of Synanon, but of the entire United States. A venomous rattlesnake hidden inside a mailbox, and an attack that could have ended in death. This event caused Synanon to be seen not merely as a controversial community, but as an organization capable of organized violence. For years, allegations of threats, pressure, and intimidation had surfaced. However, most of them could be denied. The snake attack of 1978 was different. This time there was a concentrated victim, physical evidence, and eventually an investigation that would reach Synanon's highest-ranking figures. According to court records that later emerged, certain members within Synanon began working on a retaliation plan against Morantz. Was the goal to kill him or merely to frighten him? This issue was debated for years. However, the method used was extremely dangerous. The attackers obtained a live rattlesnake. There are statements indicating that the rattles on the snake's tail were removed to make it behave more aggressively during the attack. This eliminated the warning sound that would normally be heard as the victim approached. This detail is considered one of the most striking indications that the attack was not random but a premeditated plan. October 10, 1978. On that day, Paul Morantz was at home. He went outside to check his mailbox. When he opened it, the rattlesnake hidden inside suddenly attacked. The snake bit Morantz's hand. At first, he had difficulty understanding what had happened. However, the effects of the venom soon began to appear. Seriously injured, Morantz was rushed to the hospital. The venom of rattlesnake is extremely dangerous. He underwent treatment for an extended period and carried the effects of the attack for years. Although he survived, some sources report that he suffered permanent damage to his hand and nervous system. Had medical treatment been delayed, the attack could have been fatal. The attack caused a huge public reaction. Police and prosecutors began pursuing the case intensively. As the investigation progressed, it became clear that the attack was not an accidental. The trail led back to Synanon members. Telephone records, witness statements, and information from within the organization shaped the direction of the investigation. Eventually, certain Synanon members were prosecuted for crimes connected to the attack. More importantly, the investigation reached the organization's senior leadership. As the investigation deepened, Prosecutors became interested not only in those who carried out the attack, but also in the leadership that encouraged it. In 1980, Charles Dederich entered into Plea agreement and admitted guilt in connection with charges involving ordering or encouraging violence by his followers. This development was devastating for Synanon because for the first time, the organization's founder and undisputed leader was accepting legal responsibility. Many researchers say that if one had to identify the single event that began Synanon's downfall, it would most likely be the snake attack on Paul Morantz, because this attack seriously reduced public support, drove away donors, increased the attention of government agencies, accelerated tax investigations, strengthened court proceedings, destroyed the credibility of the leadership. After this, Synanon began to be remembered not as a rehabilitation movement, but as a cult increasingly resorting to violence. The venomous rattlesnake placed in Paul Morantz's mailbox was not merely an attack on a lawyer. It became the turning point that allowed the entire country to see the dark face of Synanon, which had hidden behind the identity of a rehabilitation center for years. However, this attack was not the end of the story, it was the beginning. Following the snake attack, police investigations would deepen. Raids would be conducted on Synanon facilities. Internal recordings from the organization would emerge, and Charles Chuck Dederich, who had appeared untouchable for years, would for the first time be forced to answer seriously for his actions. One of the most powerful rehabilitation movements of its era would soon begin collapsing under financial crises, losses, and public pressure. In the next episode, we will examine in detail how the snake attack was uncovered, what evidence was seized during police raids, what Dederich said in the recordings, and how Synanon's collapse began. If you are enjoying this series, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you can be informed when new episodes are released. The most critical stage of this story, from Synanon's rise to its collapse, awaits you in the next episode. See you next time!